scientism of people like Kant and Mill wanting to universalize the use of scientific method, hypothetico-deductive method, that kind of universal extension of the scientific mode of explanation was picked up again by Bertrand Russell, developed with considerable more technicality with his logical atomism, which you will have noticed seemed to presuppose an atomistic metaphysic as well. We'll see that comes into play in the discussion today. And then picked up again with Wittgenstein in his Tractatus along very similar lines. Now, logical positivism continues that 19th century positivist emphasis. In the 19th century, that was the term coined by Kant for his third positive stage, where we're dealing with objective, empirical data of a scientific sort and seeking to formulate empirical generalizations with explanatory power. So, continuing then that positivist emphasis on objective empirical data, continuing the positivist unity of science theme, but the logical added, the logical adjective, logical positivism, to stress the influence of Russell's emphasis on the logical use, logical form of the language. So 20th century logical positivism has its roots then in people like Kant, Mill and Mach. There was a Vienna circle of logical positivists which developed in the 1910s and the 1920s, which shaped the continental development of this movement. The English development was sort of a spin-off from the Vienna circle, but then was popularized by A.J. Ayer in his Language, Truth and Logic. Within the Vienna circle, you have people like Moritz Schneck and Rudolf Carnap. Those names you'll find referred to in the literature. And the main significance of the Vienna circle, in which incidentally Wittgenstein participated after he had dropped out from Oxford and gone back to Austria, but the significance of the Vienna circle is in their initial development of the movement from a rather naive kind of empiricism into one which recognized that if we distinguish between sense, data, and material objects, we tend towards a phenomenalist epistemology, and one which recognized that we cannot always have direct empirical verification of an apparently empirical statement. Sometimes it has to be indirect through the logical implications of that statement in conjunction with other assertions. But the Vienna circle laid the foundation. Now, both in the Vienna circle and in A.J. Ayer, the basis, a crucial basis, the thing which gave it its distinctive impact, and the demise of which led to the demise of logical positivism, the distinction was its verifiability theory of meaning. Now, let me stress that it's not a theory of how you ascertain truth. It's not a theory of truth, even though the word verifiability is used. It has to do with the meaning of language. It's a theory about language. And you can get what the theory is rather simply if you look at this diagram, where language has basically two uses, cognitive and non-cognitive. There are all sorts of non-cognitive utterances, emotional exclamations, questions, cries, expressive statements. And on the other hand, the cognitive statements, yes, the cognitive make statements. Statements of two sorts, synthetic and analytic, which sounds like a reversion to David Hume. Synthetic statements being factual, matters of fact, which one would expect to be amenable to empirical verifiability. And analytic statements, in which the predicate is logically contained within the subject, have simply formal meaning, in the sense they're simply talking about the logical use of the subject and predicate. Of the latter sort, you have definitions, you have tautologies, and depending on the logical positivist, you likely have mathematical statements. But basically, any statement which has the logical form of the laws of thought, A equals A. A is not non-A. So a definition is included, a tautology is included. And if it is maintained that mathematical statements are analytic rather than empirical, as Mill had thought, then they're included as well. Now, the verifiability theory is a theory about the meaning of factual statements. That's where it focuses. And the theory is stated, for instance, by Stumpf, when he says that the meaning of a factual statement is the method of its verification. The meaning is the method of its verification. Now, that's perhaps not very illuminating, except that it does emphasize the importance of empirical procedures, empirical verification procedures. More specifically, the meaning of an empirical statement is in its reference, in its sense, its reference to empirical data, whether those actually available or possible empirical data. So the method of verification is important because you must know how data in order to be able to say what sort of data a statement would refer to. And so the method of verification is essential to ascertaining the meaningfulness of a factual statement. Now, the distinctions beyond that begin to appear. So that if you read the preface to this second edition, mine's more dog-eared than yours is, but if you read the preface to this second edition, you'll find that Ayer distinguishes between direct and indirect verification. So that the statement, I see a house, is directly verifiable. And because it's directly verifiable, it has factual meaning. It doesn't matter whether it's true or false. Its meaning is such that you could, if you wish to, but that's left for scientists, you could ascertain the truth or the falsity, if you know the method of verification. The philosopher's concern is simply to ascertain whether it is a factually meaningful statement. And for that, all you need to know is that there is a method of possible verification. On the other hand, indirect verification requires other premises which would entail directly verifiable statements that are not deducible from a given statement alone. Take, for instance, a statement like, this key is made of iron. This key is made of iron. Now, that I'm seeing a key would be directly verifiable. But that this key is made of iron would, for verification purposes, require methods of ascertaining what the metal is. And so in conjunction with such further premises, then certain possible observations might be deducible, which would verify indirectly that this key is made of iron. So direct or indirect verification. And Carnap laid a lot of emphasis on the importance of indirect verification in the sciences. That's one distinction. In his first chapter, Ayer also distinguishes between in practice. Now, it's verifiable in practice that I see a room full of faces in front of me. But it's only verifiable in principle that mushrooms grow on the other side of the moon, or that Cleopatra wore a red gown on her 21st birthday. That is to say, if we were able to go to the other side of the moon, we would know what observation procedures to use. And if we could go back in a time machine to Cleopatra's times and check up on her 21st birthday, then we would be able to verify that she wore a red gown on her 21st birthday. That statement is then verifiable in principle. So you see, the verifiability principle makes it possible to admit historical statements, statements about the future, statements about what is technologically impossible, in practice not possible, but in principle possible. What it disallows is the kind of statement that is not at all available to empirical verification, namely metaphysical statements of a reality in itself that is distinct from all appearances. And I say a reality in itself because when you read Ayer's first chapter on the elimination of metaphysics, you begin to see that the kind of metaphysics he's eliminating is the F.H. Bradley kind, where Bradley, the Hegelian, distinguished between reality and its varying degrees of appearance. The reality in itself is not empirically accessible. Talk about it is not empirically verifiable. That metaphysical assertion would be eliminated. But the various appearances, they are, of course, empirically accessible. And so there's no problem in talking about appearances. But the metaphysic that is eliminated is the one which makes a distinction between the thing in itself and the thing for me. The underlying reality and the world of appearances. Okay? Now, there is a third distinction, which he makes in the first chapter, page 37, a distinction between strong and weak verification. Strong and weak verification. Strong verification would be conclusive. It would provide you with certainty, the sort of thing which the foundationalist would want. Weak verification would be satisfied with probability. Now, Ayer is perfectly happy, then, to define a verifiability principle which admits indirect verification, verification in principle rather than necessarily in practice, and weak rather than strong verification. Okay? Keep that in mind, it's very important. Now, let me make some comments about the kinds of response that this verifiability principle met with. Because within a couple of decades, it was having to be reformulated under criticism. Indeed, some of these distinctions which Ayer introduces were distinctions introduced in response to criticism. Criticism of too narrow an empirical criterion. And eventually it was the criticism of this verifiability principle which led to the demise of logical positivism. Now, one of the first criticisms was that empirical generalizations are not verifiable even in principle. Empirical generalizations are not verifiable even in principle. And that is to say, with a generalization, there are always more possible cases that are inaccessible. So that any statement about all members of an extensive class would, by the verifiability principle, be without factual meaning. And the response to that was to claim that, all right, what we need is a falsifiability principle. That is to say, an empirical generalization is always falsifiable in principle. If you could find one negative instance, you falsified the generalization. Okay? All Cretans are liars. Now find a native Cretan who's not, and you falsified the general statement. What this then means is that you simply want a proposition, a purportedly factual statement, to be amenable to either verification practices or falsification practices. Verifiability or falsifiability, some such, for it to have empirical reference. You might say, why not insist simply on falsifiability? Well, you see, the thing is that while an empirical generalization is not verifiable, but is falsifiable, a singular assertion about a particular case is verifiable, but it's not always falsifiable. You see, there exists a so-and-so who, it's not always falsifiable. how do you know that there does not exist someone of that description who's hiding every time you go looking? Yes. So you need both the verifiability and the falsifiability. The second line of criticism was to do with the status of the verifiability criterion itself. The positivist tells us that all statements are either synthetic or analytic, factual or formal. Which is the statement of the verifiability principle? Is the verifiability principle a factual statement? That is indeed the meaning of meaning? Or is it a formal statement, analytic? Well, it becomes very evident that the verifiability theory is not an empirical statement that is amenable to verification or falsification by empirical procedures. I had a professor in graduate school in the 50s who, to make the point, said, people have made something else by meaning all the way through history. That is to say, if this were an empirical description of factual meaning, that the only factual meaning is with reference to empirical objects, to empirical data, then it would be impossible for people to find things meaningful which refer to other kinds of entities. As, of course, they do. Plato found it very meaningful to talk of real forms. Theologians find it very meaningful to talk of God. And neither of these are empirically accessible for verification purposes. You see. So it is plainly either a factually false statement, or it is not a factual statement. Now, I got the point. And he backs up from claiming that it is a factual statement about the meaning of factual statements, and contends, instead, that it is a methodological stipulation. In other words, it's a rule that the positivist adopts for methodological purposes. Well, if that's the case, and you don't want to adopt it, you don't have to. And consequently, the verifiability principle loses its hold on philosophical discourse. You see. If you want to be an empiricist, if you want to be a positivist, then this is a good principle to work by. But if you don't want to be a positivist, then obviously there's no necessity incumbent on you that you adopt it. And the whole tempest began to subside. You see. It's hardly a definition, it's much more an arbitrary principle. And just because it is supposedly common to the empirical sciences does not mean that it's applicable to all factual statements. But that led to a third line of criticism. You see, the verifiability principle was developed on the assumption that it was the operative principle in the empirical sciences. But we began to get developments in philosophy of science which made it plain that the sciences are not purely empirical. And so this is not even the principle that's applicable to the empirical sciences. Now you can anticipate what those developments were. They were the developments that began to recognize subjectivity in natural science. Developments that began to feel the influence of Kant's a priori grids, the Copernican revolution, in the natural sciences. Developments that began to reject the oversimplicity of the hypothetico-deductive method. And let me mention 3 or 4 of these. One was the work of a man named Norwood Hanson, a book of his called Patterns of Discovery. Hanson taught at Yale, history and philosophy of science, and his historical research led him to the conclusion that all observations are theory-laden. And you don't have to have a very sophisticated appreciation of scientific method in order to see that. The scientist doesn't just stand around gawking at all possible data. The scientist comes with a working hypothesis, so that his relevant data, their relevance is defined by the working hypothesis, which in turn is suggested by a theory. In other words, there are antecedent conceptual factors which determine what data you take into account. Theory-laden observations. Second example is one you're probably more familiar with, Thomas Kuhn. His work on the structure of scientific revolutions, published in the 1950s, in which he, on the basis again of his history of science studies, began to recognize that theories are part of a much larger conceptual paradigm, and that scientific revolutions occur when there are paradigm shifts, changes of the Ptolemaic cosmology to a Copernican cosmology. There's a paradigm shift. Now his point is that you may get periods of progressive increase